It is a peculiar trait of human nature. Lord Peter Wimsey once remarked to a frankly disinterested Inspector Parker that people almost always draw their curtains at precisely the wrong moment, whether through bourgeois instinct or a subconscious attempt to render one's secrets less visible to the Almighty. One tugs the heavy draperies shut just when the world outside most demands scrutiny. "If I am ever found strangled in my sitting room," he mused over a tepid martini, "do make certain to note whether the curtains were drawn before or after the deed. It tells volumes more than any bloodstain." As it happened, when the body of Mrs. Lavinia Tolland was discovered at precisely 6:15 on a Monday morning in the modest yet fusty drawing room of Garmond Hall, the curtains were drawn rather tightly, and quite deliberately, if the particular cross-pull of the thick cord was to be believed left-handed and anxious, as if done in some haste. The housekeeper, a woman of ample forearm and minimal imagination named Mrs. Mott, had entered the room bearing the breakfast tray, 2 slices of toast with quince jelly, a soft-boiled egg, and a pot of what she described, rather optimistically, as coffee, and found her mistress slumped in the wing-back chair by the fireplace, with the poker lying in a curiously diagonal fashion upon the carpet. The scene had all the hallmarks of that grotesque theatricality which one associates with amateur dramatics or country murders. There was no blood, but the expression on Mrs. Tolland's face was sufficient to cause Mrs. Mott, who had once nursed a shell-shocked cousin through a particularly vivid nervous breakdown, to emit a sort of whistling sigh and drop the tray with a clatter that reverberated throughout the dismal household. By 9 o'clock, the police had arrived, looking severe and provincial and entirely unwilling to declare anything more definite than foul play is suspected. This pronouncement did nothing to calm the nerves of the already twitchy inhabitants of Garmond Hall. There were the usual: a widower's son with curious hands and a stammer, a distant niece who had recently returned from the continent with artistic pretensions and an excess of scarves, an uncommonly greasy curate lodged in the East Wing, and a parlour-maid who wept without visible provocation. At 11:30, Lord Peter Wimsey arrived, not because he had been summoned, but because he had, in a fit of ennui, accepted an invitation to luncheon from Canon Bletchley of St. Marguerite's, the neighbouring parish. Having arrived somewhat early, deliberately, for he held all clergy to be disorganized and abominably late, he had taken it upon himself to wander through the misty lanes of Wiltshire. A little rural architecture appreciation, he called it, though he had, it should be said, come dressed in dove-grey spats and a felt fedora better suited to a Milanese opera. Seeing the unmistakable flashing of a constable's bicycle and the knotted brows of villagers pretending not to stare, Wimsey made his way up the gravel drive of Garmond Hall with the air of a man disappointed not in the tragedy, but in the aesthetics of the crime. "Morning, my dear Inspector Mould," he greeted the officer on the scene, a florid man with eyebrows like nesting birds. "Tell me you haven't let the body be moved yet. One must be allowed some diversion." "I didn't know you were on the case, my lord," said Mould, bristling slightly but not altogether ungrateful. "Nor am I," said Wimsey brightly, "but you know how it is, some chaps do crossword puzzles. I solve a good strangling over my eggs." He was ushered into the drawing-room with a sort of strained tolerance. The fire had gone out, leaving a smell of ash and something vaguely chemical. The curtains remained drawn. Wimsey paused, glanced at the hearthrug, at the untouched breakfast tray, now reassembled with a poignantly broken egg, and tilted his head toward the tall window. "I say, Mould, would you be so good as to let me draw these curtains for a moment? I promise not to abscond with the evidence." The curtains were drawn back with a slight effort, and the pale morning light revealed what the lamplight had not: a fine trail of ash leading not toward the hearth, but away from it, ending in a small charred scrap lodged under the settee. Wimsey did not touch it. He simply cocked an eyebrow. "She was alone when she died, I take it?" he said softly. "So it seems." Curious, isn't it? How a lonely woman manages to drop a poker and tug the curtains after dying of what you'll soon call heart failure or possibly arsenic, if you're feeling poetic. He turned back to the window, gazing out into the gently rotting garden beyond. Tell me, did anyone hear the bell ring last night? The bell? Yes, the one above the drawing-room mantelpiece, the servant bell. Bit gothic, don't you think, to summon help in the dead of night when help's the last thing one wants? He did not wait for a reply, but walked to the mantel and studied the bell's thin chain. It swayed slightly, with a rhythm too slow for wind. Most uncivil. Of her, said Wimsey cheerfully, to die with the curtains drawn. But then, perhaps she didn't draw them. He smiled, and it was a cold, private smile, meant for himself alone. I suppose, said Wimsey lightly, as he crouched beside the soiled hearthrug, that no one has confessed yet. Inspector Mold grunted. Nothing quite so convenient, I'm afraid. Everyone in the house claims to have slept through the night like babes in their cribs. Mrs. Mott says she last saw the deceased at 9:15. A touch of warm milk and 2 pages of the life of Saint Dorothea, if you can believe it. The niece says she was out walking till 10, alone, and Mr. Julian Tolland claims he retired at 9:30 due to a sick headache. Does he suffer them regularly? Not that I've been told. Wimsey nodded, rising. Then we must assume, mustn't we, that this particular headache struck with uncommon punctuality. He turned, studying the room with the mild disapproval of a man who finds the staging of a play excellent, but the casting questionable. The drawing-room of Garmond Hall was a curious place, tasteful in a particularly antiseptic way, as though its previous owners had once possessed charm, but died before they could pass it down. The furniture bore the burden of generations without pleasure. There were no books. Wimsey disliked rooms without books. He preferred his corpses surrounded by the comfort of literature. Do you know, Mold, he said, the thing that bothers me most aside from the poor woman's expression, which is not so much fear as distaste, is the window. The window, my lord? Yes, look at it. Not a smudge. Not a smear. Clean as an altar cloth, in Wiltshire, in spring. It's either witchcraft or fresh linen. He walked to the sill and pressed 2 fingers gently against the pane, then inspected them. Not even dust. Yet the rest of the room has that settled film of country house grime. There's a brass monkey on the mantel with a 1/2 inch of soot on its head. But this? Pristine. Inspector Mold shrugged. Housekeeper said she wiped it yesterday morning. Wimsey's smile sharpened. Did she indeed? How very convenient of her. But we'll test that presently. He returned to the chair where Mrs. Tolland had been found and examined it more closely. It was a high-backed thing with chintz upholstery, flanked by 2 side tables, one bearing a brass lamp with a green glass shade, the other empty save for a dainty porcelain ashtray and a folded lace handkerchief. Wimsey sniffed the ashtray. He did not smoke himself, but found the olfactory notes of various tobaccos nearly as telling as perfume. Not hers, he murmured. Beg pardon? This ashtray, Turkish blend. Light and dry. Mrs. Tolland, I'm told, disapproved of cigarettes. Particularly foreign ones. Said they reminded her of nightclub singers. Then whose? A question worth asking. Wimsey bent to the chair's arm and fingered a small snag in the fabric. You see here? A thread, not torn precisely, but drawn back, as though someone had caught it with a ring or perhaps a button. It would take pressure to do that, not merely sitting. He stood again and looked at the poker. It had been laid with almost ceremonial care, not dropped, but placed angled just so across the rug, its end gleaming faintly. It had been polished. Recently, too recently. Wimsey doubted Mrs. Mott took such scrupulous care with her hearth tools unless a visitor was expected. He turned. Mold, have you a notebook? Of course. Then let us begin our little collection of questions. First, why were the curtains drawn when the window had so clearly been cleaned? Second, if no one smoked in this room, who left the Turkish ash? Third, why does a woman known for her meticulous housekeeping have a single snag in her favorite chair? Fourth, why, in the name of Polonius, would she ring the bell in the middle of the night and then proceed to die in complete silence? Mold blinked. You think she rang it? I think someone did. Look here. He pointed to the bell chain. It was looped twice at the top, the way it often was when shortened to prevent pets or grandchildren from treating it as a novelty. But one of the loops had been recently disturbed. The layer of dust on the brass mount had been fingered clumsily, as if someone reaching up in haste had knocked it. The bell may not have rung, Wimsey said, but someone pulled it. Then perhaps realizing their mistake unhooked it quickly and fled. A clumsy improvisation, not the act of a born criminal. He stepped back, examining the geometry of the room, his eyes narrowing. There's something theatrical about this, he murmured. Something far too neat. A drawing room murder should be messy, especially with a poker. Yet this is all a little too symmetrical. Perhaps, said Mold, you'd like to speak with the family. Oh, said Wimsey, his voice brightening as if someone had offered him champagne at tea. I thought you'd never ask. They began, as protocol and decency demanded, with the son. Julian Tolland, 32, was a dry-mouthed sort of man with a habit of pressing his thumbs together as though performing an invisible trick. He received them in his mother's study, surrounded by volumes of sermons and unsent letters. Of course, I'm quite devastated, he said after a perfunctory greeting. My mother and I were well, not close, precisely, but cordial. She could be a little difficult. In what way? Asked Wimsey. Oh, firm in her views, religious, rather exacting in matters of morality. She didn't much care for women who drank sherry before dinner or for men who parted their hair in the middle. She believed in standards. And was she disappointed in yours? Julian flushed faintly. She may have felt I lacked ambition. I manage the accounts for the diocese office in Swindon. It's dull, but respectable. Respectable, but dull, said Wimsey gently. An admirable English compromise. He paused. May I ask, Mr. Tolland, do you smoke? No, not even Turkish blends? Julian blinked. Good heavens, no. I can't bear the smell. Then forgive me, but who does smoke in the house? No one. Except, he hesitated. Well, perhaps Isabel, my cousin. She was in Paris for several years. She brought back a number of habits. How Parisian of her. She's harmless, really, Julian added. A bit dramatic, but she adored my mother. Wimsey tilted his head. Adoration and drama rarely sleep in the same bed. Would you say your cousin keeps irregular hours? She takes walks late. At night. Sketches in the early morning. She's very creative. And where was she last night? She said she went down to the stream. Sketching moonlight on the water. I didn't see her. Wimsey nodded, smiling faintly. Moonlight sketching. A charming alibi if one is painting landscapes. Less useful when one's aunt is found dead under one's very window. He glanced toward the mantel clock, which had stopped at 2:17. How odd, he said. Has this been repaired lately? Julian shook his head. It's always been temperamental, loses time. Or freezes it, said Wimsey, and turned to go. Outside the study, Inspector Mold raised an eyebrow. You think he did it? Oh dear no, said Wimsey cheerfully. He's far too boring. And real murder requires a touch of imagination. He stepped lightly toward the stairs. Come, let us see this artistic cousin. I want to ask her why one draws curtains before drawing breath. And with that, Lord Peter ascended the stair, already humming a phrase from La Boheme. Lord Peter found Miss Isabel Tolland in the upstairs morning room, surrounded by an assortment of sketchbooks and half-finished watercolors. The sort of scattered artistic detritus one might expect from a young woman recently returned from Paris, but scarcely from the rigors of rural Wiltshire. She was a striking figure, all long limbs and luminous eyes that suggested a taste for the dramatic, yet tempered by a habitual nervousness that lent her an air of guarded fragility. "I'm so sorry about my aunt," she began without prompting, her voice lilting with an accent that was at once precise and deliberately affected. "It's all terribly sudden and, well, I suppose one could say rather inconvenient. You see, I had only just returned, and now ... She trailed off, biting her lip. "Indeed," said Wimsey, folding his hands neatly behind his back. "Inconvenient is often the polite term used in such circumstances. Pray, Miss Tolland, what were you doing last night?" She flushed faintly and glanced toward the window where the heavy curtains remained stubbornly drawn despite the morning light now filtering through. "I was out by the stream, sketching the moonlight on the water. It's my usual practice when the world is quiet. I find inspiration in solitude." "A charming alibi," Wimsey remarked with a faint smile. "May I ask, then, who can confirm your whereabouts during that time?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No one. I was alone. Alone with the moonlight and your brushes." He allowed the irony to hang in the air, then gestured toward the half-finished sketch on the easel, a delicate rendering of silvered water, reeds bending gently, a sky thick with clouds. "It's rather lovely," he added. "Thank you." "And the Turkish cigarettes found in your aunt's drawing room?" "I'm told she abhorred smoking." Isabel's expression darkened, the first flicker of defiance crossing her face. I don't smoke. I despise it. If there were such cigarettes, they were certainly not mine." "Curious, considering you recently returned from Paris, where, as we know, smoking is somewhat of a national pastime." She laughed nervously. "I can assure you, Lord Peter, I have better tastes." Wimsey nodded, but the question lingered. "Did your aunt ever have reason to be displeased with you? Any quarrels?" She looked genuinely pained. "No, never. Though she did disapprove of my bohemian lifestyle, as she called it, but there was no animosity." "Sometimes, Miss Tolland," he said softly, "disapproval can mask deeper feelings. Jealousy, resentment, or worse." Before she could respond, Mrs. Mott entered the room with a fresh pot of tea and a pile of scones, looking as though she had walked through a gale. "Miss Isabel," she said briskly, "your aunt asked me to remind you about luncheon at 1. And if you'd be so good as to keep the curtains drawn. The morning light is not good for the paintings." Wimsey's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, the curtains, always the curtains." He poured himself a cup of tea, eyes never leaving the housekeeper's impassive face. "Mrs. Mott," he said, "would you be so kind as to recount your movements last night? From the time you finished your supper, that is, until the discovery of Mrs. Tolland." Mrs. Mott's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I was in the servants' quarters until just before midnight. I went to check on the fire in the drawing room and found it smoldering low. The curtains were drawn then, but I thought nothing of it. I returned to bed and was woken early by Mrs. Tolland's body being found." "Did you hear the bell at any time?" "The bell? No, my lord." "Nothing unusual." Wimsey's gaze sharpened. "Yet the chain on the bell in the drawing room was recently disturbed. Would you have any idea how that might have come about?" Mrs. Mott blinked, confusion evident. "No, my lord. The bell hasn't rung in years. Mrs. Tolland preferred to summon me by voice or letter." "Very well," said Wimsey, setting down his cup. "Thank you." He returned to the window and examined the lock closely, twisting it experimentally. "Does anyone have keys to this room besides Mrs. Tolland and yourself?" "Only the butler, sir," Mrs. Mott replied. "Mr. Cripps. Then it would seem we have a curious triangulation of access: the butler, the housekeeper, and the deceased." Wimsey's mind ticked over quietly, cataloging the facts, the gaps, The curious dissonances, later that afternoon, after the police had begun their rounds and the family gathered uneasily in the drawing room. Now, curiously, with the curtains half opened, Wimsey sought out Mr. Cripps, the butler. The man was a gaunt figure with a face like parchment, his every movement precise and controlled, as if he were performing a carefully rehearsed role. "Mr. Cripps," Wimsey began with customary politeness, "I trust you find the affairs of Garmond Hall sufficiently engaging at present?" Cripps nodded stiffly. "It is regrettable, my lord. I am told the drawing-room bell has not rung for many years." "That is correct, my lord. It was decommissioned after a fault was discovered some time ago. Yet someone appears to have pulled the chain recently, disturbing the dust and paintwork." Cripps's expression did not change. "I cannot explain that, my lord." Wimsey studied the man's face, finding nothing that might betray deceit, only the unyielding reserve typical of a seasoned servant. "Tell me, Mr. Cripps," Wimsey continued, "did Mrs. Tolland have any recent visitors?" "Unusual guests, perhaps. A few acquaintances from the parish, my lord, none unexpected." "Did she, by chance, receive correspondence or parcels that were, shall we say, less conventional?" Cripps hesitated fractionally. "Mrs. Tolland was rather private. Occasionally, she received letters of an ecclesiastical nature." Wimsey smiled faintly. "I do hope they were signed with something less sinister than your humble servant in Christ." Cripps allowed himself a faint twitch of a smile, though it was gone almost before it appeared. As Wimsey left the room, he noticed a slight misalignment of the heavy carpet underfoot, the edge not quite meeting the polished parquet beneath. It was a subtle irregularity, but one that seemed oddly deliberate. Returning to the drawing room, Wimsey made a mental note to inquire later about the carpet layers and the lock mechanisms in the adjoining rooms. The family gathered again at luncheon. Conversation constrained beneath polite veneer and frequent glances at the curtains, still hanging, half shielding the outside world from prying eyes. Julian Tolland spoke, breaking the fragile silence. "It's all so perplexing. Who would want to harm my mother?" Isabel added softly, "She wasn't unkind, merely demanding. Perhaps someone grew tired of her expectations." The curate, Reverend Marlowe, seated quietly near the window, coughed lightly. "It is difficult to speak ill of the dead, but Mrs. Tolland's severity was known. She could be frightening, even to those who loved her." Wimsey listened, noting the tension in the room, the subtle exchanges of meaning hidden beneath formal speech. Later that evening, having requested the housekeeper's permission, Wimsey examined the drawing room once more, this time with the curtains fully drawn and the shutters closed. The room was dim and silent, except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. He sat in Mrs. Tolland's chair, the upholstery snagged at the arm, and allowed his thoughts to wander over the day's discoveries: the disturbed bell chain, the pristine window, the Turkish cigarette ash, the curious snag, the frozen clock, the half-open curtains. Then, reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small pocket watch and set it ticking. Time, he mused aloud, the most merciless of judges, and yet so easily fooled by those who understand its intricacies. Outside, the faint echo of the parish bell told the hour, its resonance threading through the thick walls like a summons to truth. Wimsey rose and paced slowly, his mind already weaving the strands of the puzzle, his keen eyes catching the faintest anomalies in the wallpaper, the misaligned carpet, and the flicker of candlelight reflected off a solitary frame on the mantel. The night stretched long before him, full of secrets waiting to be uncovered, and he was more than ready to begin the unraveling. The dawn was reluctant to break over Garmond Hall, as if the house itself conspired with the lingering shadows to conceal the day's truths. Lord Peter Wimsey rose early, not from a sense of propriety or habit, but because the puzzle before him had settled into his thoughts like a persistent whisper. The drawing room, with its heavy curtains now parted to admit a pale, reluctant light, awaited his renewed scrutiny. He took the stairs quietly, pausing outside the door of Mrs. Tolland's private study. The butler had informed him that the room was untouched since the previous evening. No one had been permitted entry save for Mrs. Mott, whose fidelity to the household code was as unyielding as the ancient oak surrounding the estate. Wimsey unlocked the door with a key borrowed discreetly from Mr. Cripps and stepped inside. The study was a modest chamber, lined with shelves bearing worn leather-bound tomes, religious tracts, and a scattering of sketchbooks. A scent of lavender lingered faintly beneath the heavier perfume of old paper and polished wood. He approached the large oak desk and began to sift through the papers. Letters, invoices, and a handful of personal notes lay arranged with fastidious care. One item caught his eye, a small folded card, its edges crisp, the handwriting neat but unfamiliar. He unfolded it delicately. "Meet me where the yew trees whisper secrets, at the stroke of midnight. Come alone." The message was unsigned. A faint chill ran down Wimsey's spine, but it was not the supernatural he feared. Rather, the meticulousness of the note bespoke a mind accustomed to control and secrecy. The yew trees, ancient and twisted, flanked the far edge of the estate, a spot both picturesque and ominous in the fading moonlight. His fingers brushed a small silver locket resting beside the note. Opening it revealed a miniature portrait of a woman with dark eyes and a sorrowful smile. Wimsey's thoughts drifted back to the drawing room and the odd Turkish cigarette ash. A plan was forming. Later that morning, Wimsey sought out the vicar, Reverend Marlowe, who was holding a quiet service for the household staff in the chapel adjoining the main house. The curate's pallid countenance was a study in restrained grief, but his eyes sharpened perceptibly when Wimsey mentioned the note. "You say it was unsigned and meant for Mrs. Tolland?" "That is correct. I found it among her papers." The vicar's lip twitched. "She never mentioned it, though she seemed restless of late, troubled by some secret." "Secrets are the currency of human nature," Wimsey remarked with a faint smile. "Do you know if anyone else might have wished to communicate with her in such a manner?" "Not from this parish," Marlowe replied. Though Mrs. Tolland had visitors who would sometimes arrive unannounced, men with heavy cloaks and whispered words, she kept their visits from the family, which caused no little speculation. Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. "Were there any disputes with neighbors or local families?" Marlowe shook his head. "Only the usual parish tensions. Mrs. Tolland was strict in her expectations and uncompromising in her views. Not everyone appreciated her zeal." "Zeal, you say? Was there any hint of obsession?" "Perhaps. She was involved with a charitable cause, but it had taken on a certain fervor. Some said it bordered on fanaticism." "Fascinating." Wimsey allowed the word to linger, then asked, "Might I see the chapel? The yew trees, too?" The curate led him outside, the morning air crisp with a hint of frost. The chapel was a small, ancient structure, its stone walls weathered by centuries, crowned by a spire that pierced the dull sky. Around it, the yew trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches whispering with the breeze. Wimsey approached one of the trees and examined the base, where the earth was disturbed as if recently turned. A faint scent of earth and moss mingled with something more metallic, barely perceptible. "Have you noticed anything unusual here?" Wimsey inquired. "Only the usual stray animals, my lord." He crouched, brushing aside some leaves to reveal a small rusted metal box buried shallowly beneath the soil. Carefully he extracted it, noting the faint imprint of a family crest. An intertwining of ivy and cross dot. Inside were a handful of letters tied with a faded ribbon, several photographs of Mrs. Tolland with a man unknown to Wimsey, and a sealed envelope marked with the same crest. Mrs. Tolland led a life more complex than the household suspects. Wimsey murmured. Returning to the house, he requested that the family gather again in the drawing room. The atmosphere was thick with unease, the curtains drawn against the fading light. As the assembled group took their seats, Isabel with her nervous fingers, Julian with his restless gaze, the vicar still pallid but attentive, Wimsey began to speak. "I have found a correspondence and photographs that suggest our dear Mrs. Toland was engaged in matters beyond her domestic duties. It appears she was involved with a man who remains a mystery to us." Isabel's breath caught audibly, and Julian stiffened. "May I ask, Miss Toland, do you recognize this gentleman?" Wimsey produced a photograph. She paled but nodded. "His name was Edward Carroway. We were close once, years ago." "And yet, no mention was made to the family of this Mr. Carroway." "Because he vanished," she said softly. "Without explanation." Wimsey observed the subtle tremor in her voice. "The letters? They speak of hope and promises broken." "He was involved in political causes, something my aunt disapproved of." Julian spoke sharply. "Political causes? That sounds like an excuse for impropriety. You were quite the rebellious one, weren't you, Isabel?" She shot him a glare but said nothing. Wimsey's eyes twinkled with irony. "It seems we have a web of personal grievances layered atop the mystery of Mrs. Toland's demise. We must consider every thread carefully, lest we miss the true pattern." As the afternoon waned, Wimsey found himself retracing the paths between the chapel, the drawing room, and the servants' quarters, noting the subtle discrepancies in time and sound. The faint echo of footsteps, the misaligned clock in the hall, the fresh impressions in the soil beneath the yews, all these details whispered secrets. He was certain now that the key to the puzzle lay not in the overt accusations, but in the shadows cast by what was omitted. The missing salver from the drawing room, the faint smell of Turkish tobacco lingering near the window, and the ever-present question of the curtains, stubbornly drawn or half open, shielding the truth like a shroud. As night fell once more, Lord Peter Wimsey lit his pipe and contemplated the day's revelations. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak or whisper carried by the wind. The game, as ever, was afoot. The following morning brought with it a thin mist that clung to the hedgerows and softened the contours of Garmond Hall, lending an ethereal quality to the ancient estate that seemed at odds with the gravity of the investigation. Lord Peter Wimsey, his mind still turning over the discoveries of the day before, found himself drawn once more to the drawing room, now tidied but still heavy with unspoken tensions. He lingered by the window where the faint scent of Turkish tobacco had earlier teased his senses. The breeze teased the half-drawn curtains, and his eye caught the slight misalignment of the brass curtain rod, a subtle imperfection that might have escaped a lesser observer, but which set Wimsey's thoughts spinning. How long had the curtains remained in this ambiguous state? Could such a trivial detail conceal a deliberate deception? His musings were interrupted by the entrance of Mr. Cripps, the ever-watchful butler, whose expression was the very picture of professional discretion, but who could not wholly conceal an undercurrent of unease. "My lord," Cripps began, his voice low, "there has been some disturbance among the staff. Mrs. Mott reports that the kitchen clock is running several minutes fast, and the housekeeper found the servants' hall door unlatched this morning. Such things are unusual at Garmond." Wimsey's interest sharpened. "Unlatched, you say? And the clock?" "Aye, my lord. Mrs. Mott is most particular about punctuality." Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. The little things, the clocks, the doors were often the keys to unraveling human intent, revealing disturbances where the eye expected order. He set out to inspect the clock himself, a heavy oak timepiece mounted near the kitchen entrance. The hands indeed showed a time that was a few minutes ahead of the pocket watch he carried, an odd discrepancy in a household as exacting as Garmond Hall. His attention then turned to the servants' hall door. Examining the lock carefully, he found the latch had been lifted from the inside, but not engaged, as if someone had entered in haste or neglected the custom of securing the door. Yet no signs of forced entry or struggle presented themselves. Curious, Wimsey murmured, that in a house governed by routine and discipline, such sloppiness should occur now. Later, he summoned the household staff for brief, discreet interviews, starting with Mrs. Mott herself, a stout woman whose countenance bore the marks of years of loyal service and steady discipline. She was forthright and somewhat defensive. When questioned, "No one's been fooling about with the door that I know of, my lord. I make sure the keys are where they should be. And the clock? Well, perhaps Mr. Cripps has been fussing with it. He's often tinkering." Wimsey allowed a faint smile. "And what of the other servants? Any newcomers, any guests who might have wandered behind the scenes?" Mrs. Mott's eyes narrowed. "No strangers, my lord. The staff are all known to each other. We've had no new faces since last autumn. From the cook, a woman named Hilda, he learned of an unusual delivery late the previous evening, an unmarked package brought by a man in a dark coat, leaving hastily. No one saw what was inside." Wimsey filed these observations mentally, then turned his attention to the household's official visitors. He paid a visit to Julian Tolland, who was pacing impatiently in the library, the strained lines on his face deepening as he considered the detective's questions. "You seem quite at ease, Lord Peter," Julian remarked, a touch of irony in his voice. "Perhaps because you haven't been summoned to sit in the dock." "Justice, Mr. Tolland, is a patient affair," Wimsey replied with a faint arch to his brow. "Might I ask about your movements last night?" Julian hesitated, then recounted a dinner at a nearby inn with a business associate, returning late but in time to be accounted for. Wimsey found no immediate fault, though he made a mental note to verify these details. The afternoon found Wimsey at the village post office, where he questioned the postmistress about recent correspondences. Her eyes lit up at the mention of Mrs. Tolland. Miss Tolland was receiving letters, yes, she said. Some were marked urgent, others quite plain. But one came from a Mr. Carroway. You might have heard of him. Odd fellow, keeps to himself mostly. Came and went like a shadow, they said. A pattern began to emerge: letters, secret meetings, disturbances in a house otherwise scrupulous in its order. Yet there remained no clear suspect, only fragments waiting to be woven together. Back at the hall, Wimsey took to reassembling the timeline with the help of Cripps, who provided a precise account of arrivals, departures, and household routines. Here, the clock discrepancies became more than trivial. The kitchen clock's 5-minute advance could mislead staff on their duties. The unlatched door suggested someone had moved unseen. Wimsey found himself drawn again to the chapel and the circle of yew trees. He lingered among their shadows, noting the slight disturbance in the earth where the metal box had been buried. The letters tied therein hinted at a clandestine relationship and potentially a motive rooted not in money or reputation, but in betrayal. His thoughts wandered to the missing silver salver, still unaccounted for since the night of the murder. Its absence was a silent accusation, a void begging explanation. As evening fell, Wimsey requested a meeting with Isabel Tolland alone. She received him in the small sitting room off the main hall, her composure brittle, her eyes haunted. "Isabel, may I speak plainly?" Wimsey began, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded, swallowing. "Your aunt's death has cast a shadow over all of us, but secrets do not die with their keepers. The correspondence with Mr. Carroway, your aunt's fervent charitable activities, the disturbances in the household, these are threads I am following. But I must ask, did your aunt ever speak of fears, of threats?" Isabel hesitated, then whispered. She was afraid of being watched, followed. "I thought it nonsense at first, but after that note, after the strange visitors, I feared for her." "Did she confide in you about who might wish her harm?" "No, she was a proud woman, too proud to admit weakness." Wimsey's gaze was steady. "And you, Miss Tolland? Is there anything you have withheld?" Her breath caught. "No, nothing, I swear it." Yet the shadow behind her eyes spoke of something unspoken, a secret she guarded as fiercely as her aunt had guarded hers. Night deepened over Garmond Hall. and Wimsey retreated to the library to review the evidence anew. The interplay of clocks and doors, letters and locket, whispered of a carefully orchestrated scheme. The case was no mere crime of passion or greed. It was a puzzle of timing and trust, a drama enacted behind polite facades. The game was growing more intricate, the players more elusive. Wimsey was certain that by unraveling the small, obsessive details, the curtain rods, the clock hands, the scent of tobacco, he would soon illuminate the heart of this shadowed mystery. But for now, the curtains remained drawn, and the house kept its secrets close. The dawn broke gray and diffident over Garmond Hall, as if the sky itself hesitated to unveil the day's secrets. Lord Peter Wimsey found himself restless, the late hour of his previous musings weighing lightly on his mind but not heavy enough to quell his curiosity. There were, after all, questions that demanded an answer, subtle threads that refused to unravel without deliberate pulling. He resolved to begin with the servants. Once more, those quiet observers of daily life whose eyes often caught what others overlooked. The butler, Mr. Cripps, obligingly arranged for a discreet assembly in the servants' hall, a place usually closed off to outsiders, but now a crucible of potential revelations. Wimsey's manner was as always unassuming, yet penetrating. His voice, laced with a wry geniality that invited confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I seek only your candor. There is no blame here, merely a desire to understand." The room, lined with worn oak benches and faintly scented with the odors of polished wood and steady toil, felt charged with unspoken tension. One by one, the staff offered fragments, footsteps heard in corridors long after the household had retired, whispers exchanged behind closed doors, a peculiar, unfamiliar scent detected near the east wing stairwell. Among them, a young scullery maid Mary seemed particularly nervous, her eyes darting as she fidgeted with the hem of her apron. Wimsey's gaze softened, and he addressed her directly. "Mary, you appear troubled. Is there something you wish to share?" The girl hesitated, then in a whisper, "I thought I saw Miss Isabel talking to someone late last night, near the chapel. A man, tall, dark coat, but I couldn't see his face. They seemed urgent." Wimsey's interest sharpened. The chapel, the very locus of the hidden box and the secret letters, was fast becoming a focal point. "Did anyone else see this man?" "Not that I know of," Mary replied, and Miss Isabel was quick to dismiss any questions. A glance to Mr. Cripps confirmed the butler's polite disapproval of loose tongues, but also his recognition of the importance of such testimony. Taking note, Wimsey decided to pay another visit to the chapel, hoping to discover what the night's shadows might conceal in daylight. The chapel's ancient stonework was softened by moss, and the air within was heavy with the scent of incense long since vanished. The heavy velvet curtains that framed the stained glass windows remained drawn, dimming the light to a twilight gloom. Wimsey's fingers traced the grooves of the stone floor, his mind attuned to the minutiae of spatial relationships. It was here, he thought, that timing might reveal its secrets. The distance from the east wing stairs to the chapel was just under 100 yards, a matter of a little over a minute's brisk walk. Yet, the shadows cast by the yews obscured the view from the main house, offering ample concealment. Wimsey's thoughts returned to the clock discrepancies and the unlatched door. Could these have been orchestrated as a smokescreen to mislead or create confusion in the timeline? His musings were interrupted by the arrival of a figure, Miss Isabel Tolland, wrapped in a dark coat, her pale face framed by loose curls. She started at seeing him but recovered quickly. "Lord Peter," she said, voice steady but eyes wary, "I thought you would not be out at this hour." "I find the early hours conducive to reflection," Wimsey replied mildly. "Might I trouble you to explain your presence here?" She glanced around nervously before replying, "I needed air. The house is suffocating, and the shadows seem less oppressive out here." There was an unspoken truth in her words, an emotional weight Wimsey chose not to press yet. Instead, he broached a topic closer to the heart of his inquiry. "Isabel, the secret correspondence and your meetings with this Mr. Carroway, what is the nature of your acquaintance?" She stiffened but did not retreat. "Mr. Carroway was my aunt's confidant and mine by extension. There were matters, family affairs, debts, and delicate negotiations." "And these negotiations?" Wimsey prompted. "Disputes over land, yes, but also over the legacy of my aunt's charitable trusts. There were questions about the management and beneficiaries." "A dispute serious enough to provoke violence?" Wimsey asked quietly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I cannot say. But the threats my aunt feared were real. She spoke to me only once before her death about someone from the past who might seek to disrupt her affairs." The phrase "from the past" stirred a memory in Wimsey's mind. Earlier, the housekeeper had mentioned a visitor from decades before, a distant relative, forgotten by most but not by the Tolland lineage. With Isabel's reluctant cooperation, Wimsey requested access to the family archives, a dusty collection of ledgers, letters, and diaries that held the keys to the lineage and its buried skeletons. As he sifted through the brittle pages, a picture emerged of a tangled family history, rife with bitterness, betrayal, and unavowed debts of honor and shame. Letters from a certain Gerald Tolland, a cousin disinherited and estranged, hinted at grudges carried across years, venomous and unresolved. Among the papers, a folded note caught Wimsey's eye, its ink faded but legible. "To Isabel, should the worst befall me, trust no one but Carroway. The truth lies where the shadows gather, and not all is as it seems." The note's cryptic tone confirmed that the victim's death was not a random act but a calculated strike in a long game of concealment. Wimsey pondered the note's implications, his thoughts turning to Mr. Carroway. This elusive figure, shadowy and removed, seemed to hold a pivotal role, whether as protector or manipulator remained to be discerned. Returning to the drawing room, Wimsey found Julian Tolland awaiting him, the man's usual impatience now tinged with something deeper perhaps. A fear of exposure. "I hear you have uncovered some family skeletons, Lord Peter," Julian said, with forced levity. "I trust you are not delving too deeply into matters better left undisturbed." "On the contrary, Mr. Tolland," Wimsey replied. "The skeletons, as you so poetically put it, often hold the sharpest bones. Tell me, what of Gerald Tolland? He has been conspicuously absent, yet his presence looms over these proceedings." Julian's smile flickered. "Gerald is a relic, a cautionary tale. We have done well to leave him in the past. Yet the past, as we see, is not so easily left behind." Julian's composure cracked for a moment before he regained his usual polish. "You would do well to be careful, Lord Peter. Some truths are better buried." Wimsey took his leave, the weight of Julian's warning settling over him like a shroud. That evening, as the household settled into uneasy quiet, Wimsey sat by the window once more, the flicker of candlelight playing upon the heavy curtains. The curtain rod, still slightly askew, seemed less a trivial detail now than a deliberate signpost. The pieces were aligning, the secret meetings, the forged timeline, the fractured family ties, and the elusive figure of Carroway. Each whispered a fragment of a story not yet fully told. Yet, as the house grew darker and the wind whispered through the yews, Wimsey knew the solution would hinge not on the grotesque or the supernatural, but on the subtle manipulation of time, trust, and human weakness. The night deepened, and the curtains remained drawn, but soon the light of truth would pierce through. Lord Peter Wimsey, reclining in the dim glow of a shaded lamp in the library, allowed his thoughts to drift over the tangled skein of facts and conjectures that had thus far accumulated. The night outside was mercifully still, but within Garmond Hall, an unsettling tension lingered, a palpability of unspoken things and unreckoned motives. The household was, in its polite silence, as restless as the shifting shadows cast by the flickering flames. His gaze lingered on the curtains, still drawn against the dawn, a detail that had become less an innocuous domestic preference and more an emblem of concealment. Wimsey mused that curtains were like people drawn tightly to hide what lay within, yet vulnerable to a well-placed draft or an inadvertent slip. The morning's discoveries demanded a fresh scrutiny of the testimony gathered thus far. Elusive Mr. Carroway, his very name seemed to dance at the edge of every whispered conversation, was a cipher. Who was he really? Protector or predator? Friend or foe? Wimsey decided to revisit the letter, the one addressed to Isabel, which hinted at trust and danger intertwined. He reasoned that the key to Carroway's identity might lie in the past rather than the present, nestled within the voluminous family archives, or perhaps in the memories of those older servants who had seen the family through decades of triumphs and tragedies. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pembleton, was a stalwart of the estate and bore the unmistakable air of one who had witnessed more than her share of family upheavals. Wimsey found her in the kitchen, carefully polishing a silver salver with a practiced hand. "Mrs. Pembleton," he began gently, "may I trouble you with a question or two about Mr. Carroway? His connection to the Tollans seems to be more substantial than I first appreciated." The woman paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in consideration. "Mr. Carroway, sir. I've known him, yes, though not as a friend to the family. He was the business agent for my late mistress, Miss Anthea, before she passed. A man with a reputation for being a touch too involved in affairs, best left alone. Did you ever hear tell of his origins? His background?" Mrs. Pembleton's lips pursed thoughtfully. "Aye, he's a Londoner by birth, from what I recall. But what he did in London, no one speaks of freely. There were whispers of debts and a certain desperation. When he came here, he tried to cloak himself in respectability." "A cloak you believe was thin?" She nodded slowly. "Very thin indeed, sir. And I've always wondered why Miss Isabel was so keen to keep their dealings secret. That confirmation was a thread worth pulling." Wimsey asked if there might be letters or records that might shed light on Carroway's London past. Mrs. Pembleton thought for a moment, then mentioned a small wooden box kept among the late Miss Anthea's belongings, items she had once insisted remain undisturbed. Wimsey requested access to the box, and soon it was brought to the library, the lock faintly rusted but yielding to his steady hand. Inside were faded letters, clipped newspaper articles, and a thin leather-bound notebook. The letters painted a portrait of a man embroiled in gambling debts and failed enterprises, who had arrived at Garmond under a cloud of desperation. One missive, penned by Carroway himself, revealed a plea to Miss Anthea for assistance, an attempt to salvage his reputation and secure a place within the family sphere. The notebook, however, was the most telling. Its pages detailed accounts of clandestine meetings, financial manipulations, and veiled threats. There was mention of an agreement signed but unsigned that bound Carroway to silence, under threat of exposure for a scandal that would disgrace the Tollans beyond repair. Wimsey's eyes traced the last entry, a scrawled note: "The truth must remain buried. The past is a weapon sharper than any blade." With this, the shape of the crime began to emerge: a murder, not born of sudden passion but carefully planned to protect secrets with deadly precision. Yet the question remained: who feared exposure enough to kill? Carroway's motives might be suspect, but his apparent desperation seemed more to ensure survival than to provoke violence. If not Carroway, then who? Wimsey turned to the chronology again. The timelines given by servants and family members still contained discrepancies, particularly regarding the period around midnight. The clocks, he recalled, had been observed to be out of sync. A minor detail, but one ripe with significance. Determined, Wimsey enlisted the help of Mr. Cripps to inspect the clocks throughout the house. It was discovered that the clock in the library was running 2 minutes fast, while the one in the East Wing corridor was lagging by a full minute. Such variations could easily have been exploited to create false alibis, Moreover, the servants had reported a peculiar silence on the night in question, a hush that seemed deliberate. Wimsey hypothesized that soundproofing measures, or the closing of doors, had been arranged to muffle the impact of events. The door to the chapel, left unlatched, might have been manipulated as part of a staged timeline. Further probing of the servants' habits revealed that one, a footman named Collins, had been unusually absent from his usual post around the critical hour. Upon questioning, Collins claimed to have been fetching brandy for Miss Isabel, a task she had assigned urgently. But the inconsistencies in his account timing, that did not accord with the other testimonies, sparked a flicker of suspicion. Wimsey arranged a quiet confrontation with Collins, careful not to accuse, but to invite truth. The footman's composure faltered under the detective's gentle scrutiny, and he confessed to having seen a figure, a man, unmistakably Caraway, leaving the chapel shortly after midnight, looking agitated and disheveled. This contradicted earlier statements and suggested Caraway's presence at a time he had previously denied. Yet, how did this square with the body's discovery, the locked room, and the servants' claims? Wimsey's mind circled back to the note about shadows and concealment. The killer must have used the confused timeline and the imperfect clocks to craft an alibi. Relying on the household's complacency and the servants' ignorance, he pondered also the psychological motives. A man desperate to maintain his reputation, a family fearful of disgrace, and a daughter torn between loyalty and suspicion. These were potent ingredients for tragedy. As the night deepened once more, Wimsey began to prepare for a more theatrical demonstration, an exercise in revealing the intricate dance of deception and truth. If the house held its breath, so too would the mystery's final act. Lord Peter Wimsey, ever the consummate strategist, found that the hour had come to enact a measure as subtle as it was theatrical. The drawing room, with its heavy curtains still clinging to the faint light of early morning, was to become the stage for his quiet demonstration. Not for the first time had he found that the very walls of an English country house whispered their secrets when coaxed by a patient and astute listener. He summoned the household for a late afternoon gathering, not as a formal inquest, but as a seemingly benign assembly, tea, mild discourse, and a touch of genteel curiosity. The family and their retinue complied, perhaps sensing the subtle shift in the air, though none could say precisely what to expect. Isabel Tolland appeared guarded, a faint crease between her brows, while her father sat with the accustomed dignified detachment that bordered on aloofness. The servants, too, assembled with a curious mix of respect and apprehension. Wimsey, with a twinkle of amusement beneath his finely arched eyebrows, began with an apology for the intrusion upon their afternoon. "I fear, dear friends, that the peaceful order of Garmond Hall has been somewhat perturbed, and I must ask you to indulge a simple exercise, a reenactment of sorts. It promises no drama, but it may illuminate the curious threads that have confounded us all." He requested the household clocks be observed, the curious discrepancies noted in their timings serving as the foundation for what was to follow. Mr. Cripps, diligent and eager, was called to synchronize the clocks as best could be managed, their faces reflecting the faint unease that accompanies any disturbance of routine. With meticulous care, Wimsey reconstructed the critical moments of the night. He instructed Collins to recount his movements, noting the footman's initial nervousness and the careful cadence with which he described fetching the brandy. Wimsey's keen eye caught every hesitation, every glance that strayed too quickly. Then, in turn, he asked Isabel to state her whereabouts, her voice steady though her fingers twitched with an undercurrent of tension. The assembled group was led through the sequence, the whispered voices in the hall, the closing and locking of doors, the muffled sounds, or absence thereof. Wimsey pointed out the significance of the chapel door, the unusual position of the key, and the locked state of the library windows, revealing how these domestic details were not mere happenstance but deliberate instruments of concealment. As the clock hands crept forward, the The detective's demonstration grew more incisive. He mimed the movements of a shadowy figure through the corridors, marking the exact moments at which sound could be stifled or fabricated by the discrepancies in clock times. The footman's story was placed alongside the timelines, the puzzle, pieces refusing to fit unless one considered the possibility that Collins's account was either incomplete or intentionally misleading. Then came the most delicate moment, Wimsey's subtle shift from external facts to the realm of psychology and motive. "It seems," he observed quietly, "that we are not merely dealing with a crime of opportunity or passion, but with one that is orchestrated by fear, the fear of exposure, perhaps, or the dread of an inherited shame." He turned to Isabel, whose eyes briefly met his with something akin to defiance or despair. "Miss Tolland, the letter from Mr. Carroway and the secret dealings of your late aunt suggest that there are truths beneath the surface, truths that some would go to great lengths to keep buried." The room was silent but for the ticking clocks each now a small accomplice in the detective's unfolding thesis. Wimsey's voice softened. "And yet, the most telling detail may well be something overlooked, a trivial object, a seemingly insignificant slip in the carefully constructed tableau of innocence." He produced a small, ornate salver from beside his chair, the very one Mrs. Pembleton had polished. It bore a faint smudge, a trace of powder that to the untrained eye would be invisible. Wimsey passed it around, watching the flicker of recognition or discomfort on several faces. "This salver," he explained, "was reported missing from the chapel the morning after the murder. It was thought lost, perhaps stolen. Yet here it is, precisely where it should not be, with a residue that speaks of the room's last occupant, and the means by which silence was enforced." The implication hung in the air like a dark stain dot as the party absorbed this. A faint rustle near the window drew Wimsey's glance. The curtains, still stubbornly drawn against the late afternoon sun, were disturbed by a slight movement. Without rising, he beckoned gently. "Might we draw them aside? It appears they have been guarding more than merely the light." The heavy fabric peeled back, revealing the garden bathed in the golden light of dusk, but also a set of footprints in the soft earth footprints freshly made, leading from the chapel door toward the far side of the grounds. "Ah," said Wimsey, with dry amusement, "our mystery broadens yet again." He turned back to the assembled company, eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. "The game is afoot, dear friends, and I assure you, the curtain shall rise fully before the morrow." The lingering shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, as if the walls themselves awaited the revelation yet to come. And in that moment, the boundaries between the polished surface of civility and the tangled undergrowth of human folly became unmistakably clear. Wimsey's mind raced with the newfound evidence, the footprints suggesting a clandestine departure, perhaps a secret rendezvous or a fleeing culprit. He resolved to investigate the garden paths at once, for it was in such overlooked details that truth often sought refuge. As he stood, the familiar weight of his walking stick in hand and the sharp clarity of purpose in his gaze marked him as the unwavering pursuer of justice amid the veiled intricacies of Garmond Hall. The players were set. The final act approached with the inexorable certainty of the ticking clocks, and as the night deepened outside, the detective moved quietly to the threshold, prepared to chase the shadows until the very heart of the mystery was laid bare. The garden, drenched in the soft gold of the waning day, seemed a tranquil place to the casual observer. Yet to Lord Peter Wimsey, the faint impressions in the damp earth were not merely footprints, they were whispered clues, subtle as a breath, waiting patiently to be interpreted. He knelt by the muddy trail near the chapel's side entrance, his gloved fingers tracing the faint outline of shoeprints pressed into the soil. The tracks were singular, no companion's marks interrupted their solitary course. They led away from the chapel door, arcing gently towards the dense shrubbery at the far end of the grounds before vanishing beneath the overgrowth. The pattern was deliberate, suggesting a cautious, perhaps furtive, departure. Wimsey's gaze shifted skyward as the sun began its slow descent beyond the distant treetops, casting long shadows that seemed to conspire with the encroaching darkness. He allowed himself a moment's reflection, mindful of the unyielding pressure of time. The day's discoveries had peeled back layers of social polish, exposing tensions simmering just below the surface tensions, not merely of money or inheritance, but of fear and concealed truths. Returning to the house, Wimsey was met by the silent scrutiny of the assembled household. Isabel Tolland, her composure as carefully maintained as her evening attire, regarded him with a mixture of apprehension and something more inscrutable, perhaps hope or dread. The household staff stood stiffly, their faces masks of propriety that thinly veiled the undercurrents of gossip and speculation. "May I trouble you all once more?" Wimsey's voice was mild, but carried the weight of command. "I propose a further exercise, one that will require your patience and candor." He began with the chapel's door itself, the small oak portal whose latch had been locked the night of the tragedy. "The key was found here," he said, holding it aloft. "Yet it was not returned to its proper place. Nor, I might add, was the door secured in the conventional manner. This discrepancy is no accident." He turned to Collins, the footman, whose earlier evasiveness had not escaped Wimsey's notice. "Mr. Collins, you told us you locked the chapel door upon leaving. Might I ask you to demonstrate the process as you performed it that night?" Collins, pale and visibly unsettled, complied. He approached the door and mimicked his previous actions, grasping the key and twisting the lock. Wimsey observed keenly the manner in which the lock engaged, a subtle resistance here, a faint click there, and the relative ease or difficulty of securing it from the inside versus the outside. "If the door were locked from inside," Wimsey continued, "how would one open it from outside without a key? Or indeed, lock it again once outside?" Collins faltered. "It's not possible, sir, without the key." "Precisely," Wimsey said, arching an eyebrow. "And yet, the door was found locked on the morning after the crime, the key not in. The lock but in Miss Tolland's possession. Do you not find that curious?" A flicker of unease passed over the assembled faces. Isabel's gaze dropped, the mask of calm momentarily cracking. Wimsey pressed on, now addressing the windows of the library, those tall, narrow panes overlooking the garden where the footprints disappeared. The windows were found latched, with no sign of forced entry. Yet, there is a faint scratch on the inner sill hardly visible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable under careful inspection. A mark made by something sharp, something slender. He produced a small pocket knife, its blade glinting dully in the fading light. Such a tool might be used to manipulate a latch or remove an obstruction. An innocent implement, perhaps, but in the wrong hands a device of opportunity. Turning toward Isabel once more, Wimsey's tone softened. "Miss Tolland, it seems the night held secrets you have not yet revealed. Your connection to the late Mrs. Meredith and the mysterious letter suggest you were privy to matters of considerable delicacy." Isabel's lips parted as though to protest, but no words came. Instead, she exhaled slowly, a subtle surrender that seemed both reluctant and inevitable. Before she could speak, a sharp knock at the front door interrupted the moment. The butler, Mr. Stokes, entered briskly to announce the arrival of Detective Inspector Harrow, who had come bearing new information from the constabulary. Wimsey excused himself briefly to receive the inspector in the study. The two men exchanged quiet words. Harrow's manner was professional but tinged with frustration. "We have uncovered a report from a nearby innkeeper," he said. "A suspicious figure was seen leaving Garmond Hall late that night, heading toward the main road. Description matches one of the household." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "Do you have a name?" "Edward Cripps," replied Harrow, "the groom. Apparently, he left without informing anyone, quite uncharacteristically." Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. I shall wish to speak with Mr. Cripps at once." Returning to the group, Wimsey announced his intention to question the groom. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken questions and concealed anxieties. Cripps was found in the stables, tending to the horses with mechanical diligence that betrayed his agitation. His hands trembled as Wimsey addressed him, the detective's piercing gaze unrelenting yet courteous. "Mr. Cripps, it has come to my attention that you departed the house late on the night in question. Might you explain this unexpected absence?" The groom swallowed hard. "I had to fetch Mr. Tolland's spare horse from the village, sir. There was an emergency with a client, and the master wished to be ready at dawn." Wimsey's eyes flickered. An emergency indeed? Might you tell me why such urgency was not communicated to the household at large? Cripps hesitated, then muttered, "I feared causing alarm." "Fear can be a potent motivator," Wimsey said dryly. "Yet we must consider whether it also serves as an excuse for secrecy." The conversation deepened, revealing cracks in Cripps' narrative, small inconsistencies about times, routes taken, and who had knowledge of his departure. The groom's nervousness suggested he was hiding something, though what remained elusive. Wimsey released him with a measured caution and returned to the house, his mind assembling the fragments into an intricate mosaic. The footprint trail, the locked chapel door, the mysterious absence of the groom all converged to form a pattern. Later, as twilight surrendered to night, Wimsey found himself alone in the library. The room, now hushed and shadowed, seemed to breathe with the secrets it harbored. He moved to the window overlooking the garden, his fingers brushing against the scratches on the sill. It was then that a faint sound caught his attention, a barely perceptible creak, the shift of fabric against wood. He turned sharply to see a figure step from the shadows. Isabel Tolland. Her eyes were bright but weary, and she spoke with a quiet resolve. "Lord Peter, I believe there is more you should know. Things I have kept to myself for too long." Wimsey gestured for her to speak, the air thick with anticipation. The puzzle was nearing its critical phase, the final pieces poised to snap into place, revealing the concealed truth behind the curtains drawn by morning. Isabel's voice was low, trembling with a tension that belied her composed exterior. "It concerns Mrs. Meredith's letter, the one that seemed to unsettle so many. I have not told the whole story, not out of malice, but because I feared the consequences." Wimsey's expression remained inscrutable, his gaze patient but intense. "You may trust me, Miss Tolland. Truth, after all, is the only remedy for shadows." She drew a shuddering breath, gathering her thoughts as the soft crackle of the dying fire punctuated the stillness. The letter was not merely a communication. It was a key to a secret long buried. Mrs. Meredith had discovered something about the estate's past, something that implicated one of the family's closest friends in a scandal that could ruin reputations. Wimsey nodded slightly. "The document you showed me hinted at such intrigue." "Pray, continue." "There was a man," she said, "a solicitor named Charles Hargrave. He had been the family's trusted advisor for decades. But recently, Mrs. Meredith learned that he had been involved in a series of questionable dealings, manipulating wills, diverting funds. The letter was her veiled warning to Edward Tolland to beware." Wimsey's mind raced through the implications. The solicitor was a man of influence, and if Mrs. Meredith had indeed uncovered his duplicity, the motive for silencing her took on a fresh urgency. But why not inform the police directly? Wimsey asked. Isabel hesitated. Mrs. Meredith feared scandal. She wished to protect the family's name, to handle matters quietly. And perhaps she did not fully trust the authorities. It was a precarious balance between justice and discretion. Wimsey's gaze swept the room, as if weighing invisible scales. And Mr. Hargrave? What of his movements on that fateful night? Hargrave was seen leaving the village just after dusk, Isabel replied. He claimed to have an appointment in the city. but no one can confirm his whereabouts thereafter. The puzzle tightened. A man with motive and opportunity, absent at a crucial time, and a victim who had dared to expose the rot beneath the polished veneer. Wimsey rose, pacing thoughtfully. It seems our suspect list must expand. The solicitor's role demands scrutiny, as does every person connected to the household. He reached for his notebook, flicking through the carefully penned observations. There is also the matter of the window latch scratch, the footprints leading into the shrubbery, and the groom's unexplained absence. They are threads in the same web, I suspect. Isabel nodded, her composure returning in part. I only wish I had revealed this sooner. Perhaps things would have taken a different course. Wimsey inclined his head. The past is immutable, Miss Tolland, but the present offers opportunity to uncover truth and render justice. As the clock chimed the hour, a knock sounded. At the door, Mr. Stokes entered, bearing a telegram marked urgent. Wimsey took it, scanning the brief message with keen eyes. It appears Inspector Harrell has obtained confirmation of Hargrave's movements, Wimsey announced. He was indeed in the city, attending a meeting that lasted until late into the evening. Yet, the alibi is supported only by one witness, a Mr. Collins, the same footman whose account has been less than forthright. A ripple of surprise crossed the faces around him. Wimsey's arch smile was faint but unmistakable. Coincidence? I think not. Turning to Isabel, he said, "We must revisit our friend Collins. His testimony is suddenly far more critical than before." The next morning, Wimsey confronted Collins anew, this time in the servants' quarters. The footman's nervousness was palpable, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. "Mr. Collins," Wimsey began smoothly, "you have served this household for years. You know the value of discretion, I am sure." Collins swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, I mean well, always." "Then you will understand my perplexity regarding certain inconsistencies in your statements." Collins flushed, his defenses faltering. I did leave the house that night, but not to lie or deceive. There was something I could not speak of. Pray, enlighten me." He glanced around furtively before whispering. "I saw Mr. Hargrave at the chapel after dark. He was agitated, pacing, speaking in low tones on his telephone. I thought it strange, but I dared not interfere." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "And did you see the solicitor leave?" "No, sir. But I heard raised voices, Mrs. Meredith's and his. They argued fiercely." A flash of insight struck Wimsey like a sudden wind. The scene was not random. It was choreographed, an exchange that precipitated the tragedy. "Why did you conceal this at first?" Wimsey asked gently. "Fear, sir, of repercussions, and of losing my place." Wimsey's demeanor softened. "You have done well to reveal this now. Truth, though delayed, remains truth." Armed with this new testimony, Wimsey requested a search of Hargrave's study. The room was precisely ordered, but beneath a loose floorboard, a sheaf of documents was discovered, letters and financial statements, implicating the solicitor in a network of embezzlement and forgery. Wimsey gathered the household once more. "We stand on the brink of revelation. The threads we have followed converge at last." He paced deliberately before continuing. "Mrs. Meredith was no mere victim of circumstance, but an intrepid seeker of justice. She confronted the true villain in our midst, a man whose facade of respectability masked a corrupt soul." Eyes flicked toward Hargrave, who sat stiffly, his mask of civility slipping. "Yet," Wimsey added, "the method of her demise was crafted to mislead. The locked chapel door, the mysterious footprints, the groom's absence, all designed to fabricate an alibi, to suggest an intruder or phantom." He fixed Hargrave with a steely gaze. "But such a deception is fragile. A single misplaced detail, a scratch on a window, a missing key, a reluctant witness can unravel even the most carefully spun web." The solicitor's facade broke. His voice was cold, bitter. "You have no proof. Proof is a matter of assembling facts, Wimsey replied smoothly. And facts, Mr. Hargrave, are stubborn things. Harrowing minutes passed as the weight of evidence settled over the room like a heavy fog. Hargrave's defiance wavered, then crumbled entirely. In the silence, Isabel stepped forward, a new resolve kindling in her eyes. "Lord Peter," she said quietly, "thank you for your perseverance. Mrs. Meredith's voice can finally rest." Wimsey inclined his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "Justice, Miss Tolland, is not a matter of chance but of careful, deliberate pursuit." As the household exhaled collectively, the curtains of deceit were drawn back at last, revealing the stark daylight of truth. The drawing-room was suffused with a muted light, the air thick with anticipation and a subtle undercurrent of relief. Lord Peter Wimsey sat comfortably in his favorite armchair, the faintest trace of a sardonic smile playing on his lips as the assembled company awaited his final words. Outside, the village clock chimed a steady, unhurried cadence, a metronome. To the denouement of a mystery that had tested the limits of civility and human nature alike. Wimsey folded his hands, his gaze deliberately sweeping over the faces before him, each etched with a mix of curiosity, anxiety, or veiled apprehension. "It has been, I confess, a most diverting exercise in human folly," he began, his voice lilting with that signature blend of arch wit and clinical precision. And yet, beneath the elaborate masquerade of petty jealousies and half-truths, the true culprit was never far from our collective ken. He paused, tapping a slender finger on the armrest, as though savoring the moment before the curtain's final rise. "Allow me, then, to recount the chain of reasoning that has led to this conclusion. As we have learned, Mrs. Meredith's discovery of Mr. Hargrave's duplicity was indeed the catalyst. Yet it was not Hargrave who silenced her, but another one, whose motives are less transparent, but no less compelling." A murmur rippled through the room. Wimsey's eyes glinted mischievously. "Recall the curious detail of the misaligned clock, the strangely muted bell, and the seemingly irrelevant rearrangement of the curtains in the drawing-room, each a subtle manipulation to mislead and obscure." He turned to Edward Tolland, the heir, who sat pale and tense. "You, Edward, were desperate to preserve the family legacy, yet burdened with debts that threatened its very foundations. When Mrs. Meredith threatened exposure, your measured facade slipped, revealing a desperation that culminated in the fatal encounter at the chapel." Edward's composure shattered. His denial faltered beneath Wimsey's calm but inexorable gaze. "Your actions were cunningly calculated, the forged alibi, the silenced bell to mask the hour, the displaced curtains to suggest forced entry, each a desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative." Wimsey's voice softened as he addressed the room. "This is not a tale of villainy in the crude sense, but one of human weakness and fear of disgrace, loss, and the unraveling of a carefully constructed identity." He rose, straightening his cravat with an air of finality. "The law will now take its course, but let us remember that beneath every crime lies a human story, complex and often tragic." With a parting smile he added, "And as Shakespeare reminds us, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." The assembled guests sat in contemplative silence, the gravity of truth settling like dust in sunlit corners. As Wimsey prepared to leave, he cast one last glance around the room, his tone dry yet genial. "I shall take my leave before the conversation grows too morose. Justice, like a good cigar, is best enjoyed with measured calm and in moderation." With that, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped into the fading light of afternoon, the mystery laid bare, the curtains at last fully drawn.